Hello and welcome to this video cast for subscribers to davidicke.com. Well, if there's anyone that doesn't believe in time travel, I have the proof. Because this is no longer 2015, it's 2003. Because what is happening in terms of efforts to persuade Parliament to agree British bombing in Syria is a mirror of what happened with Tony Blair in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. We have lies about intelligence, lies about 70,000 free army Syrians being on the ground to take over ISIS territory as they're pushed back, in theory, by the bombing. All lies. And this has come from the Joint Intelligence Committee, Cameron tells us. Well, for that, let's go back to the sexed up dossier in 2003, the pack of lies that justified the invasion of Iraq, from which so much slaughter, chaos and mayhem has followed. Instead of Tony Blair, we have Tony Blair Mark II, Prime Minister David Cameron, grotesquely exploiting the horrors of Paris to justify more horrors in Syria. We have Labour MPs in the opposition party, and apparently members of the shadow Labour cabinet, who are now saying that they will vote with Cameron to have the British bombing in Syria. We're having members of the shadow cabinet apparently saying they're going to resign over the stance of the leader, Jeremy Corbyn, that he's against it. Well, what I say to those shadow cabinet people is, sod off then. Let's get someone in who's got half a brain cell to see what's going on. And what I'm going to do today is connect the dots, which I've been connecting all these years, and here it is unfolding now on the TV screen. I'm going to connect the dots that puts what's happening now in its true context. And of course, after Paris, which gave them the impetus to push for this further bombing in Syria and to take freedoms away at home, we had the incident this week with the Turkish fighters taking down the Russian plane, claiming that it was in effect invading Turkish airspace. Well, it came down in Syria, not Turkey, and even the Turkish authorities are only claiming that it crossed into Turkish airspace for 17 seconds. Russians say it didn't go in at all. And here we have a member of NATO, very significant as we'll see, Turkey, with this criminal dictator, President Erdogan, who has played a fundamental part in the creation and sustenance of ISIS, taking out a Russian plane, clearly premeditated, immediately following Paris, and at a time when Russia has gone into Syria and actually started to try to take ISIS out, which of course the Americans and the others have not tried to do, because ISIS is their creation to take out President Assad of Syria. So we now have this incident with blazing headlines. Here we go. monstrous new crisis over Russia's downed jet. War looms as IS seeks to get nuclear bombs. Whoa, frighten them some more, then they'll give us their freedom. And it's terrifying how easily Turkey and Russia could take the world to the brink. Well, Russia didn't. It didn't shoot its own plane down, did it? You may have seen some videos circulating on the internet, certainly they're on my website, in which I was talking some time ago, well before all this started, and further back in my books and talks, much further back in the talks, about the plan for a third world war involving NATO and the West pitched against Russia and China, and the fact that the plan was to trigger this out of the Middle East. The question is, how did I know that? And the answer to that question puts current events into their true perspective. First of all, forget countries, forget individual countries, forget individual leaders. What you have, and I've exposed this in such detail in my books over decades, what you have is a hidden hand that works through governments, no matter what party is in government. They're always there. They're the constant. They work through secret societies and semi-secret groups and through agencies and organizations that we actually see in the public arena but don't know the real background to. And they have had a long-term plan for this world and the human race. And it is to create a global fascist, communist, call it what you like, same bloody thing in the playing out, a global fascist, communist, Orwellian state of total control involving a world government, world central bank, world army, microchipped population and then some, world single currency, cashless, no physical money. Been talking about that for 25 years. Look what's happening. And part of this plan of transforming the world into this global police state and centralized tyranny is a series of wars. There's nothing that changes a society more than a war, and if you want to change global society, you need global wars. Look how fewer hands power was in after the First World War than it was before. And again, pushing it on, how that continued after the Second World War. And there's always been a plan for a Third World War to complete the process of creating a centralized global dictatorship, in the end justified by we must stop this ever happening again. What you're not being told is that those who will say that are the ones that have created all the mayhem to justify the transformation of global society. So what I'll do now is just put together a few pieces to put current events into context. In the year 2000, in September 2000, there was an organization in America called the Project for the New American Century. It was peopled by those who came in shortly afterwards to the Bush administration when it took power in early 2001. They included people like Cheney, became vice president, president in truth, and Rumsfeld became defense secretary, Wolfowitz, who became deputy defense secretary but was actually the real defense secretary, and a stream of others who came into significant positions of power in the Pentagon and elsewhere with the Bush administration in 2001. And they included a long list of prominent Zionists with fundamental connections to Israel. The reason that is significant is that in September 2000, this organization produced a document calling for the American administration and military to embark upon regime change after regime change in country after country, fighting what they called multi-theater wars. These countries included Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, etc., and also called for regime change in China. Oh, that'll be interesting. The people behind that document then came to power in early 2001 with the Bush administration. Now, that document in September 2000 said that this process of transformation, this regime change, would be slow, quote, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. One year to the month later, after they were now in power, America had what Bush called our Pearl Harbor, 9/11. As a result of that inside job, the official story is a fairy story. The process of picking off countries on the list began. With, of course, Iraq we've had, and Libya and Syria now, and it goes on. So, let's go to Iraq. Shortly after 9/11, matter of days, General Wesley Clark, former Supreme Commander of NATO, told a television program in 2007, he said that a few days after 9/11, he went to the Pentagon and he met Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and all these characters, and then he met a general that he knew. And he was told that they were going to invade Iraq. And of course, Clark is taken aback. What do you mean you're going to invade Iraq? Why? The guy didn't seem to know because of compartmentalization. He probably didn't know. And a little while after that, not long, after America was now in Afghanistan, Clark went back to the Pentagon and met that same general. And Clark says to him, and go on the internet, put a few keywords in, and you can watch the interview. Clark said to him, "Why aren't we invading Iraq? You said we're going to invade Iraq." And the general said, "It's worse than that, sir." And he pulled out a document from a drawer, and he said, "We've just had this down from upstairs," in other words, Rumfeld's office, and that they were going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. Among them, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran. And so they started to pick the list off. And of course, there was Iraq. The idea was to invade Iraq, but there was no reason to do that. This brings us to Tony Blair and George Bush and the infamous, blatantly mendacious, sexed up dossier talking about the threat of weapons of mass destruction from Iraq and Saddam Hussein that has now been exposed as a complete pack of lies. While Bush and Blair were saying right up to the Iraq invasion in 2003, it could still be stopped if Saddam Hussein will get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, which he didn't have. It's now known that Blair agreed with Bush on that invasion a year earlier. And I've shown in my books, years ago now, in fact in 2003, that it goes back even further. What was happening and why they needed the lie of weapons of mass destruction was they had this list of countries for regime change and acquisition, and they needed excuses. They go into Afghanistan, "Oh, get bin Laden, he was behind 9/11. What, from a cave in Afghanistan? Then Iraq, weapons of mass destruction, and in they go. And at around the same time, a weapons inspector called David Kelly, Dr. David Kelly, told a BBC reporter that that dossier justifying the invasion had been sexed up. In other words, it was full of bloody lies. And this was very dangerous to this lie to justify the invasion of Iraq, to pick it off the list. So he committed suicide. He committed suicide as much as I committed suicide yesterday. He was murdered, taken out. And the reason he was taken out, and the reason the official story of his suicide is so ludicrous and chock full of holes, is because he was taken out because he had the knowledge as a weapons inspector who had been to Iraq many times to know that it was all a scam. So, Iraq picked off. Untold numbers of people dead, slaughtered, maimed. A country torn asunder. And if you think, just contemplate the number of dead people that have resulted from the lies of Bush and Blair and the people behind them, where the real power is, it is unspeakable. And all this chaos that has followed on purpose, come to that, is the result of that same pack of lies from Blair and Bush. And far from making their millions since they left politics, they should both be under lock and key for the rest of their lives, with a key thrown mid-Atlantic. Let's look at the list. Libya. We'll have that one now. You keep giving the same excuse, war invasion after war invasion, then people are going to go, hold on a second, what's going on? So you keep changing it, or changing it a bit. So what you do then, you want to get rid of Gaddafi in Libya. So what you do is you train, arm and fund freedom fighters, better known as terrorists, to start attacking the Gaddafi regime. And when he responds, you say that Gaddafi is killing his own people, and to protect them from violence, you have to go in and bomb the shit out of it, including all those civilian areas. Go on the internet, go onto an image find search engine and put in Libyan devastation, destruction, whatever, from NATO bombing, or worse to that effect, and see how the people of Libya were protected from violence. These people are not just psychopaths, they're super psychopaths, and they're running our world, and we need to take it back from them. So, Iraq was left in devastated, catastrophic chaos, violence, upheaval. Libya was left in chaos, violence, and catastrophic upheaval. And they moved on to Syria. And they did the same job. They funded, armed and trained freedom fighters of the so-called Free Libyan Army. Moderates. They're moderate. Yeah. They killed people moderately. In very large numbers. And they started attacking the Assad regime in Syria. Same script this time. And Assad responded, he's killing his own people. And so these terrorists were funded, armed, well documented now, funded, armed and trained by the West, particularly America, on behalf of the Hidden Hand. And all this mayhem and violence has unfolded. Al-Qaeda, which was the organization blamed for 9/11 and connected to Osama bin Laden and Afghanistan, that justified them going in there, actually was the creation of the United States. Al-Qaeda stands for the base or the database, and it comes from the database of Mujahideen fighters funded and armed by the Americans to fight against the Russians in Afghanistan. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, Jimmy Carter's former national security advisor, who is part of this hidden hand cabal, has actually admitted that he funded and armed and all the rest of it, the Mujahideen, which became Al-Qaeda. So we fight Al-Qaeda, well, we don't, these psychopaths do, or soldiers on their behalf. They never fight anybody, sipping bloody coffee in Washington and Downing Street, saying, we're going to fight the terrorists. No, you're not, you ain't going anywhere. I'm going to send other poor buggers to do it. So here we have a situation where this Al-Qaeda, the creation of the United States, and they use it then to fight in the Middle East, because Al-Qaeda's dangerous terrorists, and then these Al-Qaeda characters are involved in the fight against Gaddafi. So now they're not so bad. And then they move into Syria under names like al-Nusra and stuff, and the whole thing morphs into ISIS, another creation, outgrowth of the Western creation of terrorism to justify the invasion of countries and to justify, through terrorist attacks, the destruction of freedom at home. But what's happened is they were held up by Assad. Assad didn't go as quickly as they thought he would. They thought he'd go about the same time as Gaddafi. And it's gone on and on and on, and they've not been able to remove Assad and take over the country. And they had another problem in that Russia was supporting Assad. And it reached the point recently where clearly Putin could see where this was going. The United States and others, Turkey, what have you, France, was supposed to be bombing ISIS in Syria all this time to destroy the terrorists. But they haven't been. They've just been getting stronger. And of course, what anyone with a brain cell could see, and certainly Putin could, is they weren't trying to remove ISIS because they wanted ISIS. They'd created ISIS to remove Assad. They want to destroy him. So Russia go in to Syria, invited by Assad, the only people bombing who have been, and they start bombing ISIS and meaning it. And suddenly ISIS start to get on the run. Ooh, that's bloody bad news. That's the last thing we want. And here it is, the Russians now supporting Assad. We've done all this to get rid of him. Oh, what's going on? He's spoiling a party here. And so we had the attacks in Paris, immediately followed by the taking down of the Russian plane by Turkey on the most outrageous, with the most outrageous excuse, clearly premeditated. And look at where we are now, because there's different levels of this, and deep in the rabbit hole, where the hidden hand is well beyond the knowledge of at least most of these players. They have the very circumstances that I've been talking about all these years for the start of World War III. They have now, on one side, the United States, the rogue state of Turkey. They have France. And of course, Cameron is desperately now, and seems to be getting support from these idiotic Labour MPs who won't listen to the common sense of their leader. They want Britain bombing in there as well. So there you have NATO. And what is the plan? To pitch NATO against Russia and China. So you have Russia now in Syria with warplanes, and they're bringing more high-tech, state-of-the-art equipment in as a result of the downing of this plane. They're also supported, as Assad is, by China. And the plan was and is for a Third World War involving NATO against Russia and China. And also in there is another target on the list, Iran, supporting Assad. So you have this powder keg situation that has miraculously unfolded, as I've been talking about it would in the light of their plans for years and years. It's unfolded like this because it's all been planned from the start. And of course, the demonization of Russia started with Ukraine. Ukraine was subjected to the latest United States organized coup to remove an elected leader, not a nice man. No, how many of them are? But an elected leader. And in was put this guy, Poroshenko. WikiLeaks have revealed communications showing that he was an insider for the United States in Ukraine for years and years before. So they put their man in, and they start the demonization of Russia, and that's been followed by what's happened since. Do you know who orchestrated the coup and the handing over of power to America's man in Ukraine? A lady called Victoria Nuland, Assistant Secretary for European and Eurasian Affairs at the US State Department. Do you know who her husband is? Robert Kagan, co-founder of the Project for the New American Century. It's a movie. And you Labour MPs better get your fricking asses in gear. Start using some brain cell activity. Start doing some bloody research and realise that you are being had again, not by a new war, but by the continuation of the same war on human freedom and human liberty. And you know, we've had Blair, Labour Party, does what he did. Now we have his opponent, whoa, David Cameron, Conservative Party, doing exactly the same. Continuing the same script. In America, we had George Bush, Republican, did what he did. And now we have President Obama, Democrat, opponent, whoa, doing the same. You know why nothing changes except that? Because they're all masks on the same face. And when that penny drops, human race, we might have a chance of sorting this out. So, let's look at some detail and different elements of this. Jeremy Corbyn, leader of the Labour opposition party, faces threat of shadow cabinet resignations. Well, like I say, good bloody riddance. Because if you've not got the intelligence to see what is happening, you should not be in politics, because you are in dereliction of duty of protecting those who put you into office. And this is going to move along in the next few days to see what happens. But you see, the thing is, we've had this new leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn. I don't agree with everything he says. I don't agree with everything he does. But he's got decent values. He's a decent man, which is a hell of a start in politics, considering what you normally get. And he doesn't want more bombing in Syria. But apart from him, who was brought in because he was elected by members, not the MPs, apart from him and the few people around him, the rest of the Labour Party, opposition, is just the Conservative Party under another name. It's a one-party state, just like America is. And that is why they are talking about voting with the Conservative Party to send planes into Syria. Obama supports Turkey after it shot down Russian jet. Here we have a country that has at most claimed, as the most it claims at all, that a Russian plane entered its airspace for 17 seconds. Like I say, the Russians say they didn't at all. And they shot it down. Now, by any criteria, that is madness. And had Syria done that to a Turkish plane, then all hell would be breaking loose now. But this is how it works. It's not about whether something is right or wrong. It's whether it serves your agenda or it doesn't. Whether the people involved are on your side or whether they aren't. Which is why Saudi Arabia, who are on the side of the cabal, can do what the hell they like. Same with Bahrain. Terrorism of extraordinary levels. And not a word is ever said by these moral psychopaths. And so, of course, Obama and NATO were not going to come out and say, actually, Turkey, that was bloody out of order. No way. Well, he's on our side. Of course he was all right, no matter what he did. Obama supports Turkey after it shot down Russian jet. US President Barack Obama speaks during a joint press conference with French President Francois Hollande at the White House. He expressed US support for Turkey after it shot down the Russian warplane and said Ankara has the right to defend its airspace. Oh, God. I mean, you know, either they're idiots or they think we are. Probably a bit of both. But some of us try not to be, eh? Turkey, like every country, has a right to defend its territory and its airspace, the puppet said. It's important right now to make sure the Russians and Turks are talking to each other to figure out what happened. Well, you know what happened. It was premeditated. It's part of this whole deal I'm describing. Oh, NATO, they support Turkey. Of course they do. Even though it is a country without which ISIS would probably not exist. And a country that is increasingly terrorizing its people and particularly its media. Turkey supported by NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, see my books, has expressed the Western military alliance's support for Turkey after an emergency meeting of all the 28 members requested by Ankara over the incident. As we have repeatedly made clear, Stoltenberg said, reading from his script, we stand in solidarity with Turkey and support the territorial integrity of our NATO ally. Of course, there's this thing about NATO, that if one is attacked, then in effect they're all attacked and they all have to support the one that's been attacked. And that is the process through which they want this Third World War to break out. The NATO chief called on the governments of Russia and Turkey to exercise restraint. Well, a bit bloody late. This is an interesting story. I'm not saying it's true, but this is certainly the kind of thing that happens. In the Arab media, information is in circulation that the plan to destroy the Russian aircraft was clearly spelled out between the leaders of the US and Turkey. It was reported in particular by Geresa News. According to the newspaper, President Erdogan allegedly received support from US President Barack Obama with a plan to shoot down the aircraft of the Russian Federation on the border with Syria. The compromising information in the Arab media was received from a source in the presidential administration in the United States, it says. Also, reports in the Arab media stated that the moment for the decision to attack the plane was taken by Obama and Erdogan at the summit of G20 in Antalya, which, of course, immediately, literally immediately, followed the terrorist outrage in Paris, just as the 7/7 bombings in London took place at the time of the G8 in Gleneagle, Scotland. So it could be, as I said last week in the video cast, be milked to justify further action on the script. Erdogan will continue shooting down violating planes. Of course, he ain't got to shoot down many more before Russia's going to be physically retaliating. And then where do we go? Turkey will open fire on foreign planes violating Turkish airspace in the future. President Erdogan warned amid a diplomatic crisis caused by the downing of the Russian warplane. If another violation of our aerial border happens, we can respond in the same way, said the genetic idiot. The plane was shot down within the rules of engagement announced earlier. Putin has said, we still haven't heard any apologies from the leadership of Turkey, nor have we heard any proposal to compensate damages or hold those responsible for these heinous crimes to account. And it says the aggravating the rift is between the two is the death of 2 Russian troops in the incident. The pilot of the downed jet was gunned down by fighters of a Turkey-supported militant group, the moderate rebels, as he was parachuting to the ground. And a Marine was killed when a Russian helicopter sent to rescue the crew came under fire from the ground. Moscow is saying that Turkey is shielding terrorist forces in Syria. Well, some of us have been pointing that out for a very, very long time, with the goal of continuing to smuggle oil across the border. I'll come to that. Turkey's actions are de facto protection of Islamic State, the Russian Prime Minister said Wednesday. This is no surprise considering the information we have about the direct financial interest of some Turkish officials relating to the supply of oil products refined by plants controlled by ISIS. One of the biggest forms of income of ISIS is selling oil from locations they've taken over, and to do that, they need the support of Turkey and, of course, Saudi Arabia and others, and that's exactly what they've got. And then, I'm not saying that this Third World War is going to break out tomorrow. But we are now very much more close to it than we were before. And the ante is being upped. This is a story of the Russian response. World-class S-400 surface-to-air missile system deployed in Syria. Russia Defense Minister has announced that the Russian Air Force base at Latakia will now be supported with these SAM systems after the unprecedented act of aggression, it says, exhibited by Turkey. He also announced the following enhancements to the Russian mission in Syria that are sure to generate anger from Turkey and NATO. 1, all Russian bombers will now be escorted by Russian fighter jets that will be able to repel any further air-to-air attacks. See the potential for this plan to play out in the current circumstances is now massive. 2 guided Russian missile cruisers have been deployed off the coast to provide long-range anti-air support, and all military-to-military contact with Turkey has been suspended. These SAM missile systems, it says, are truly world-class. It has a range of 400 kilometers and is capable of destroying tactical aircraft, strategic aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. The whole thing is moving so fast as a result of what's happened. Another story about the Russians mentioned there, deploying a missile cruiser off Syria that will target threats. And then there's sanctions by Russia on Turkey. Russia is preparing wide-ranging economic sanctions against Turkey over the plane attack, and the Prime Minister has said the measures will be drafted within days and could hit joint investment plans. Speaking at a televised cabinet meeting in Moscow, he said the government has been ordered to work out a system of response measures to this act of aggression in the economic and humanitarian spheres. He said the focus would be on introducing limits or bans on Turkish economic interests in Russia and a limitation of supply of products, including food. And he said tourism, transport, trade, labour and customs, as well as humanitarian contacts, would be affected. This is a point, actually. The biggest foreign source of foreign tourists in Turkey, which is, of course, massively important to their economy, is from Russia. And what you are seeing with these various incidents and terrorist attacks is the, I would say, systematic destruction of the tourist trade in the Middle East, because they want to destroy it not just militarily, they want to destroy it economically. And the more that the economies collapse, the more people will want to head for Europe in desperation. So what you've had, for instance, is this incident is obviously going to dramatically affect the tourist industry of Turkey. Then you have the plane taken down, the Russian plane, a tourist plane in Egypt, which is, of course, dramatically going to affect the tourist industry in Egypt. And of course, you had the grotesque terrorist attack on the tourists, the British tourists, on the Tunisian beach at a tourist hotel. How many people are going to be going back to Tunisia for a holiday now? There are so many levels of this. And I've just finished a book which is about to go to the printers. Should be out very early in the new year, which kind of explains how this whole thing can play out in such detail, how it's done, and you have to go real deep in the rabbit hole for that. Then there's a strange story running on RT this week. Mystery over who bombed Turkish convoy allegedly carrying weapons to militants in Syria. Now, Turkey has been the conduit for supplying ISIS all along. Like I say, it couldn't really exist without Turkey. And this story says, footage released online by the Istanbul-based Humanitarian Relief Foundation, the IHH, shows plumes of smoke from the burning trucks and people running about in panic. At least 20 trucks were engulfed in flames. This is after the Russian plane was taken down. The mission, however, wasn't sponsored or organised by IHH, the group said. No organisation has yet confirmed that the convoy belonged to them. Our teams helped to extinguish the fire. The trucks do not belong to us, and there's no information on who bombed them, an official of the group said. At least 7 people were killed and 10 injured in the incident, according to the Turkish news agency. The trucks were reportedly heading to a town of Azaz in northwest Syria. Since the news emerged, media has been furiously speculating about who was behind the attack, what the trucks were transporting, what the convoy's humanitarian mission was. So much support and supplying of these terrorist groups is done under the cover of humanitarian aid. Or maybe it was carrying a more sinister load than humanitarian aid, it says here. One of the aid workers who survived the incident said the trucks had been deliberately targeted, Reuters said. The nature of the humanitarian aid is also in question. Turkish media and the IHH say the trucks were transporting humanitarian aid to refugees in Azaz. However, a Turkish newspaper cited sources close to the Syrian government saying the convoy was delivering weapons to terrorist organizations. The Hawa news agency reported that Turkey repeatedly sent convoys with arms to the al-Nusra Front, the affiliate of Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations under the guise of humanitarian aid. Reports on Twitter went further. They identified the arms as allegedly Docker machine guns and small arms with ammunitions. In the wake of the recent downing of the Russian jet over Syria by Turkish fighter jets, some reports suggest the Russians were avenging the pilot's death. Many media outlets thought it was the work of Vladimir Putin. Now, here's another aspect to this. Russia is obviously, in the focus at the moment, but China also has people in there. And something else happened amid all the furore over the downing of the jet, and that's that a Chinese hostage was killed, or reported to have been killed by ISIS this week. And the Chinese government says, in effect, we'll be striking against them. Now, China has its people in Syria supporting Assad, and so does Iran. So you have this, like I say, the lineup planned for the Third World War is all in that little area, which is about the size of Washington State. And this is a story. Iran quietly deepens involvement in Syria's war. And, it's kind of interesting that they're on that list. And we've had this agreement after all that kind of stuff about Iran's nuclear weapons program. We suddenly had this agreement out of nowhere, and that's kind of gone away. But it's still on the list for regime change and takeover. If this unfolds in the way that it's going at the moment, and we, of course, hope it doesn't, then Iran gets pulled into the fold through that means, rather than what was going on before with their so-called nuclear weapons program. A furore led by Israel that has a massive nuclear weapons program that America never talks about. It says here, the new offensive launched by Syrian government forces in the countryside south of Aleppo has shed light on Iran's growing role in Syria's civil war. Officially, Iran denies it has deployed any combat troops in Syria, but a week before the offensive began, it was reported that hundreds of Iranian troops had arrived in Syria in preparation for an imminent assault on rebel-held areas. Iran also announced the deaths of 4 high-ranking officers from the Islamic Revolution Guard Corps, and at least one of them, Brigadier General Hossein Hamedani, the most senior Iranian military officer to have been killed so far in the conflict, lost his life near Aleppo. According to Iranian media, 18 high-ranking Iranian officers have been killed in Syria in the past 3 years, but the killing of 4 in just 1 week, particularly one just before a major offensive, implies that Iran may be more involved in the war than has been previously acknowledged. Iranian commanders, or several of them, have also warned that they would take revenge on the terrorists who killed the general, Hamidani, suggesting the force might have troops on the ground in Syria. Iranian officials have so far said that the most significant contribution to the defense of President Assad has been the creation of the paramilitary National Defense Forces, which now had 100,000 fighters. And the general who was killed has said that 130,000 militiamen and women were ready to go to Syria if necessary. You can see it building here. It says here, Iran's foes may worry that the troops may also be feeling emboldened by the results of the troops and the government, by the results of the recent nuclear deal, which paves the way for lifting of sanctions, likely benefiting the force with a source of fresh funds. But that's just part of the script, part of the game. There is still the goal of doing to Iran what has been done to Syria, Libya, Iraq, and so on. US deploys dozens of ground troops in Syria. The United States has deployed dozens of ground troops to Syria, claiming that it will assist Kurdish forces, any excuse will bloody do, in their battle against Daesh, ISIS, terrorists, sources say. The so-called Syrian Observatory for Human Rights said on Thursday that 30 US soldiers arrived in the northern city of Kobani over the last 2 days, AFP reported. Actually, you'll find it's far more than 30. And this Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, I bloody love it. All the mainstream media are quoting this, right, as a source of news about what's going on in Syria. And the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, that's telling the media, therefore telling people what's happening in Syria, is based in Coventry. And it's one man who hates Assad with a vengeance. He sits in his house in Coventry in the English Midlands, pouring out information about what's going on in Syria, all of which is anti-Assad. And because it's the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. One bloke with a massive axe to grind. And it goes on, US officials have told the Associated Press that Russia has directed parts of its military campaign against US-backed militants and other extremist groups in an effort to weaken them. Yes, because they know, the Russians know, that all those moderate rebels have just been created to remove Assad, including ISIS, and therefore, if they don't deal with them, you don't stop what's going on. And Syria has been gripped. Here's some figures for you. Syria has been gripped by foreign-backed militancy since March 2011. The crisis has claimed the lives of more than 250,000 people in a land the size of Washington State, and displaced millions of others. So we have boots on the ground, American boots on the ground, while Obama is saying there won't be boots on the ground. Will there be? Well, there'll be some booties, some trainers. There won't be any boots. And boots on the ground at a full-out war is what the plan wants. And it's another one. Don't rule out British boots on the ground in Syria, says William Hague. This bloke was the former Foreign Secretary, a very strange man who always reminds me of a little boy in short trousers whenever I see him. British authorities should not exclude the possibility of sending ground troops to Syria if they want to defeat Islamic State, former Foreign Secretary William Hague has suggested, close associate of Cameron. In a piece for The Telegraph, he argues the extremist group, what's he talking about? British government, American government, Turkey? What's he talking about? Oh, ISIS. Oh, okay. The extremist group, which controls swathes of Syria and Iraq, cannot be destroyed without boots on the ground. That military presence should be Syrians, Iraqis, or other Arabs, but it would be a mistake for Britain or Western nations to rule out some of our own forces operating there if that can make the crucial difference to the outcome. Hague served as Foreign Secretary between 2010 and 2014. He was involved in all the destruction in Libya. He said the case for military operations in Syria is very different to that of Iraq in 2003. You must be joking, mate. He said the long overdue Chilcot report into the Iraq war will be a time to acknowledge that we were wrong about the invasion of Iraq. But we're all right now. It's always, well, we've learned our lessons. Mistakes were made in the past. But structures have been put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again. Now, we're going to do it again. Oh, God, the world is insane. Now, this is interesting. Hague, former Foreign Secretary, suggests one solution to the ongoing conflict would be to partition Syria, and Iraq. The borders of Syria and Iraq were largely drawn by two British and French diplomats in 1916. He writes, they should not be considered immutable. If the leaders of either country cannot construct a state where all communities can live together, it might be right to consider international support for their partition. Kurds have shown their ability to run their own affairs. A subdivided Syria might now be the only one that can be at peace. Just so happens that the Zionists and Israel have the concept of the Greater Israel, which is the land from the Nile in Egypt across to the Euphrates in Iraq. And part of that Greater Israel plan is to partition Iraq and Syria. Now, oh God, White House gave ISIS 45-minute warning before bombing oil tankers. Now, as I've said, the United States has not been trying to defeat ISIS in Syria. It created it. Don't want to defeat it. Well, make a bomb here and there, make a loud noise, or we're fighting ISIS. But of course, they haven't been because they don't want to. And here's a classic story. Why did it take 15 months for the US to target the Islamic State's oil infrastructure? Well, the reason is because that's where it gets much of its money from, thanks to Turkey and others. But as soon as Putin and Russia went in, they started bombing the oil infrastructure of ISIS. So, of course, the Americans were embarrassed into doing the same, but as little as possible. That's what this story's about. Oh dear. The Obama White House is giving ISIS a 45-minute warning before bombing their oil tankers by dropping leaflets advising potential jihadists to flee before airstrikes in Syria. Get out of your trucks now and run away from them, the leaflets say. Warning, airstrikes are coming, oil trucks will be destroyed, get away from your oil trucks immediately, do not risk your life, the leaflet reads. The leaflet drops are justified under the premise that the oil tanker drivers might be civilians and not ISIS recruits, although it's an explanation that doesn't wash with critics. Well, killing civilians has never troubled them before, and of course these oil tanker drivers are connected to ISIS. And it says here, it's not like these drivers are innocent, uninvolved civilians like children or sick people, writes J.E. Dyer in an article. They're waging ISIS's war just like the other non-uniform participants who make up 100% of ISIS's ranks. This is how far the Obama administration is going to avoid collateral damage, and who knows, it might be worse. Front Page Mag's Daniel Greenfield makes a similar point, commenting, so after all this time, they came up with a great plan. Drop flyers on ISIS trucks so that the drivers who may or may not be ISIS members can run away in time. Meanwhile, ISIS gets 45 minutes warning. Compare the White House Obama approach to fighting ISIS to that of Russia. While it took the US 15 months to begin targeting ISIS, oil refineries and tankers, airstrikes by Moscow destroyed more than 1,000 tankers in a period of just 5 days. In comparison, Colonel Steve Warren said that the US had taken out only 116 tanker trucks, the first strike to target ISIS, lucrative black market oil business, which funds over 50% of the terror group's activities. US airstrikes targeting ISIS oil assets are so rare that public service broadcasting in America was caught using footage of Russian fighter jets bombing an oil storage facility in Syria and passing it off as evidence of the US targeting the Islamic State's oil infrastructure. US military pilots have also confirmed that they were ordered not to drop 75% of the bombs on ISIS targets because they could not get clearance from their superiors. You went 12 full months while ISIS was on the march without the US using that air power, and now as the pilots come back to talk to us. They say 3/4 of our ordnance we can't drop, we can't get clearance, even when we have a clear target in front of us, said House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Ed Royce, who while retired 4-star US General Jack Keane labelled the policy an absurdity from the beginning. But it's only an absurdity if your goal is to destroy ISIS, but it ain't. So given that, it's not absurd. It's what you need to do. Leave them alone. It says numerous analysts claim that the Obama White House's 15 months wait before it began targeting the primary funding mechanism behind ISIS was part of a policy to help Islamic State overthrow Syrian President Assad. Of course it was. Earlier this year, a document emerged confirming that the Pentagon foresaw the rise of ISIS and that Western support for al-Qaeda groups and other anti-Assad rebels in Syria would lead to the emergence of a Salafist principality that would help to isolate Assad. The bottom line, the most irrefutable truth, is that the US and its regional allies were all in on the use of Sunni extremists to bring about regime change in Syria, and that was the strategy from the word go, and a direct result of the strategy that is ISIS, said Zero Edge. The US didn't want to cut off Islamic State's funding because without money the group couldn't fight Assad. We have the New York Times also reporting that US Central Command may have engaged in a year-long effort to deliberately conceal the fact that the United States plan to demolish ISIS was not effective, brackets on purpose. Evidence also continues to emerge that ISIS is receiving support from state sponsors of terror like Turkey and Saudi Arabia. $800 million worth of ISIS oil has been sold in Turkey, a US ally. ISIS trucks are routinely allowed to cross back and forth between the Islamic State stronghold of Raqqa and Turkey, while the NATO country facilitates black market oil sales on behalf of the terror group. Documents that have come to light, a large cache of intelligence recovered from a raid on an ISIS safe house this summer confirms that, quote, direct dealings between Turkish officials and ranking ISIS members was now undeniable. Which brings me to this. A WikiLeaks revelation this week. Hillary Clinton claims Saudi Arabia is the largest donor to Sunni terrorists worldwide. Of course, Sunni terrorists, ISIS. WikiLeaks has struck again. This time they have revealed a US government cable sent from the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, to the Treasury Office that specifically alluded to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia's substantial financial donations to international terrorist groups fighting the US armed forces. I mean, it sounds ludicrous, and on the surface it is, if you think that America is actually trying to do what they say they're going to do. But when you realize what they're trying to do, it all makes sense. While it's insanity if you see it from that other angle. According to this cable, quote, donors in Saudi Arabia constitute the most significant source of funding to Sunni terrorist groups worldwide. This is the same Saudi Arabia that is causing catastrophe, death and suffering in Yemen without a glimmer of response from the moral West, and beheads people every few days. Saudis use UK missiles on Yemeni civilian targets, says rights group. Here we have this moral Cameron wanting to go and bomb in Syria because of the moral crusade against terrorism. And here's the Saudis killing in Yemen using British weapons. Saudi Arabia used British-made cruise missiles during an attack on a civilian Yemeni factory, say Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. According to a report published by the Human Rights Group on Wednesday, remains of a PGM-500 missiles, or remains of a few of them, manufactured by the UK firm Marconi Dynamics, were found in the rubble of a factory that was targeted near the capital in December. in September rather. The attack on a factory in the Sana'a governorate, which appeared to be producing only civilian goods, killed one person and was apparently in violation of international humanitarian law, as if the Saudis could give a damn about that. And earlier this month, British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond announced that weapons exports to Saudi Arabia would be halted if investigations prove that Riyadh is breaching international humanitarian law during its ongoing aggression against Yemen. You bloody liar. Of course they know what's going on. How much more do you want? Here you go. We'll send it to you. Go and kill some more people. The latest revelations show UK policy to be both misleading and seriously ineffective. Despite multiple well-documented cases of violations of the laws of war by the Persian Gulf Coalition in Yemen, UK ministers have consistently refused to acknowledge this, said the director of Human Rights Watch, David Mepham. Well, you know, see above. It's interesting. Yemeni sources say some 7,500 people have lost their lives in the Saudi attacks. And the United Nations puts the death toll at 5,700, including 830 women and children. But when this is how it, you know, I described the world once as like throwing 50 balls of wool into a little room, putting 50 kittens in there, and then coming back a few hours later and someone saying, sort out the mess. It's just, everything is so distorted, so full of ignorance, so full of